can. Okay, so we are now going to be journeying south a little bit and crossing the Mediterranean and looking at what is going on in Egypt around this time. Now, the lecture will focus on a series of events that take place in Egypt. Well, as you'll remember what Stephen talked about, this so-called First Peloponnesian War, roughly contemporary with that. So it's essentially in the lead up to, I guess, the more commonly accepted Peloponnesian War. And really what we're going to see and talk about is the rebellion of Inaros II against the Persians. And I suppose part of what we've also mentioned today, this almost kind of Athenian, let's call it empire building, that's going on, where Athenian soldiers are actually going to Egypt to help the Egyptians out, or help Inaros out at least, against the Persian occupiers. So we're going to look at Inaros himself. Who was he? And we're going to look at this Athenian adventure in Egypt, essentially, and how that all plays out. Now, in order to understand the situation, we need a little bit of context here. So Egypt had been an independent kingdom, obviously, for thousands of years at this time. That largely comes to an end with the fall of Egypt's 26th dynasty and the Achaemenid or the Persian conquest of Egypt under Cambyses. Now, we have a number of sources for why this occurs, this Persian conquest, and they are a little bit problematic. One of them, of course, being Herodotus. Herodotus essentially tells a story of a sort of diplomatic breakdown between Egypt and Persia, which is occasioned by Amasis, the pharaoh of Egypt, the king of Egypt, sending an Egyptian doctor to the court of Cambyses. And this Egyptian doctor is not very pleased about being shipped off to Persia. So he lays a trap for the Egyptian king, and he suggests to Cambyses that Cambyses should ask the Egyptians to marry an Egyptian princess. Now, that is a bit of a problem because, and this is something that Herodotus gets absolutely right, the Egyptian royal family throughout most of pharaonic history have been extremely opposed to the idea of allowing Egyptian princesses to marry foreign rulers. In fact, during the 18th dynasty, when the Egyptians had diplomatic relations with Babylon, the king of Babylon, Burnaburiash, actually sends two of his own daughters to marry the king of Egypt, Amenhotep III, and in exchange asks for one of Amenhotep's daughters. And he is basically flatly told no. It is against the custom of the Egyptians to send their princesses to marry foreign rulers. And Burnaburiash keeps kind of, wheedling this point and pointing out how unfair it is that the Egyptian pharaoh is marrying foreign princesses left, right, and center, but is refusing to send any of his own daughters. And in the end, he's actually reduced rather pathetically to asking the king of Egypt to send any Egyptian noblewoman, basically, and the king of Babylon will then pass her off as an Egyptian princess to his court, which is a little bit sad, to be honest. So when Cambyses asks for a daughter of Amasis, that does present a problem for the Egyptians, because the Persians are at this point the vastly superior power. But at the same time, the Egyptians are loath to acquiesce to this particular request. Now, what Herodotus says happens is that Amasis, essentially the Egyptian king, basically tries to pull a fast one on the Persians. He orders a noblewoman, the daughter of a former Egyptian pharaoh whom Amasis had killed in order to take power. He orders her to go to Persia and pretend to be his daughter. That was obviously never going to work. She immediately confesses the truth to Cambyses. Cambyses is insulted and furious and assembles his armies and launches an invasion of Egypt. Now, in reality, the invasion of Egypt was quite a mammoth undertaking. It required the signing of multiple passage agreements with various tribes in the Near East. The Persians also did various deals with traditional allies of Egypt, including in the Hellenistic world, to stop them coming to Egypt's aid with ships, for instance. So it was clearly something that was planned for a fair amount of time. Herodotus, uses it as part of his story about Cambyses and his madness. as this almost sort of spur of the moment decision, which clearly it wasn't. Amasis, the Egyptian king, dies immediately before the Persian invasion. So Egypt's armies are commanded by Psamtik III, a new, young, very untried, untested pharaoh. And he decides to face the Persians at Pelusium, the great Egyptian border fortress. And for reasons that are not quite clear, he does not actually take up positions inside the very well defended fort. He takes positions between the fort and the sea on a plain. And he is roundly defeated. And then the Persians essentially take care of the garrison at Pelusium. Now, Herodotus also tells that the Egyptians were defeated because the Persians tied cats and other Egyptian sacred animals to their shields and used them as a way to undermine Egyptian morale, essentially. This is a particularly hilarious interpretation of this story, where the cats are actually used as missiles by a Persian rider who's flinging them at the Egyptians. Now, the problem is that's just nonsense. The Egyptians had no objection as such to animals that were seen as sacred being killed. They had an entire industry of producing animal mummies by raising cats and jackals and even crocodiles expressly to be slaughtered as juveniles and mummified. So I doubt they would have been particularly concerned by this, but it's one of these stories that Herodotus comes out with. So the Egyptians lose the Battle of Pelusium. The Persian army totally steamrollers into Egypt, conquers Memphis, gets rid of the Egyptian pharaoh. He's murdered after attempting to plot against Cambyses. And from that point onward, Egypt is under Persian occupation. Now, the Achaemenid or Persian occupation of Egypt follows two distinct periods. So there's the first Persian satrapy, which is from 525 to 404 BCE, which is the period that we're in now. Then there's the second Persian satrapy, which is about 343 until the arrival of Alexander. There is an interim period between the two occupation phases where the Egyptians essentially managed to kick out the Persians and set up their own royal dynasties. Unfortunately, it seems that the only thing these Egyptian pharaohs like to do more than fight the Persians is to fight each other. So it's basically a period of civil war in Egypt with all these different princings and various remnants of old royal families vying for power. And that period of kind of interim warfare and Egyptian governance to an extent is then ended by a second Persian conquest led by Artaxerxes, which then brings Egypt back under Persian control for a short while until the arrival of Alexander. Now, the period that we're talking about is the first Persian satrapy, and it is a time of multiple Egyptian rebellions. The Egyptians really chafe under the rule of the Persians. This is not unexpected. The Egyptians had previously been occupied by the Assyrians, and it was essentially a period of non-stop revolts. The Persians do not help this because they basically leave Egypt in the control of a satrap and remove much of the Persian army from Egypt the moment it's conquered. So they leave their own administration quite vulnerable in a sense. The other problem is that there have been, prior to the Persian invasion, a period of Egyptian history with a lot of different royal families. So there are lots and lots of noble people around Egypt who feel that they have a claim to the throne. So you have all these pharaohs popping up all over the place, trying to take control of Memphis and declare themselves the official ruler of Egypt. One of these, and arguably one of the most successful ones, is a man called Inaros. We don't know anything really about Inaros's early life. The Egyptian sources are virtually silent about him. We have very little monumental evidence of his life and his reign. We mainly know about him from Thucydides and from Herodotus. It is possible, given that the name of his father was Psamtik, which is a royal name that was used during Egypt's late period, that he was a princeling of the displaced Saite royal family. So essentially the family that the Persians had kicked out of power, that he was somehow related to that, or perhaps a cadet branch of the family, something like that. In either case, he launches a rebellion against the Persians. And from what we can tell, the form of that rebellion first really focuses on getting rid of Persian tax collectors, especially in an area of the Western Nile Delta. So he essentially kills or captures and gets rid of any kind of local Persian representatives, rallies people to his cause, and then begins an all-out assault on the Persian garrisons around the Nile Delta. And the idea there is to essentially rid the delta of the Persians, and then from there march on the Persian main force and the Persian satrap in Memphis. So essentially, Inaros seems to have his power base somewhere around here between what would later be called Alexandria, but of course it wasn't founded yet, and the old Egyptian capital of Sais in the Western Nile Delta. And the idea was essentially to liberate this area here and then use that as a staging post to launch an invasion or an attack on Memphis itself. Now, we have some sources about Inaros, as I said, one of them being Herodotus. Unfortunately, it's not terribly detailed. This is what Herodotus says. After being persuaded to send an expedition against Hellas, Xerxes first marched against the rebels in the year after Darius's death. He subdued them and laid Egypt under a much harder slavery than in the time of Darius, and he handed it over to Achaemenes, his own brother, and Darius' son. While governing Egypt, this Achaemenes was later slain by the Libyan Inaros, son of Samticus, or Samtek, or Samtik, however you want to pronounce it. So at the time of Inaros' rebellion, the satrap, the governor, Persian governor of Egypt, is a man called Achaemenes, who's related to the Persian royal family. Now, it's interesting, Herodotus describes Inaros as being a Libyan. And this is something we also see in Thucydides. Meanwhile, Inaros, the son of Samticus, king of the Libyans who border on Egypt, had induced the greater part of Egypt to revolt from King Artaxerxes. He began the rebellion at Maria, a city opposite the island of Pharos, which is quite close to what would later become Alexandria, and having made himself ruler of the country, called in the Athenians. They were just then engaged in an expedition against Cyprus with 200 ships of their own and of their allies, and quitting the island, they went to his aid. Now, there are a couple of interesting points here. First of all, we get an idea of where Inaros' power base was, basically in this area here. Granted, that is quite close to the area that we would call modern-day Libya, which begins somewhere out here, and also the Marmarican coast here, which Egypt at the time and earlier considered part of what they called Chehenu or Chemech land, basically a kind of foreign territory that wasn't really part of Egypt. Now, Inaros being king of the Libyans might make you think that he couldn't be related to the Saite royal family who came from this area here, and that he wasn't even Egyptian. Now, I think that this is actually a bit of a misunderstanding of the Egyptian royal titulary, basically. From the end of the late Bronze Age, the early Iron Age, and onwards through the Third Intermediate Period, and also into the late period, the Saite dynasties, the Egyptian kings many of them had taken the title chieftain of the Meshwesh, or great one of the Meshwesh, where the Meshwesh was basically one of the names that the Egyptians had for Libyans. The reason for that was after the Libyan invasions at the end of the late Bronze Age, the Egyptian state allowed a lot of Libyans to settle here in the Nile Delta, and they basically set up their own parallel administration. Some of them even rose high enough to actually become pharaohs, and they retained that somewhat antiquated title of theirs, great chieftain or great chief of the Meshwesh or the Libu, which was another Egyptian name for the Libyans. And the Egyptian pharaohs of the late period immediately before the Persian occupation basically just took that title and added it to their ever-growing titulary. So it is entirely possible that if Inaros considered himself a rightful heir to the Saite royal family and therefore a rightful king of Egypt, he would actually have used the title chieftain or king of the Libu or the Meshwesh, which might be where the idea of him being a king of the Libyans comes from, because I don't actually think there's much evidence to suggest that he was in fact Libyan from Cyrenaica, somewhere like that, much, much further west. He seems to have had his power base very firmly in the western Nile Delta, ironically enough, quite close to the old capital of Sais, incidentally. Now, the Athenians are called to help, and this makes sense. There had been a lot of very positive relations between the Egyptians and the Greeks in general during the late period. The Egyptians had allowed the Greeks to set up a colony basically at Naucratis here, and also given them all kinds of beneficial trade arrangements, in particular Psamtik I and also Amasis II seem to have been very pro-Greek and have given a fair amount of decent trade deals and trade relationships with the Greeks, and also incorporated a great number of Greek mercenaries into the Egyptian fighting forces. In fact, Amasis was even described by Herodotus as a Philhellene, as a friend of Greeks. So the Athenians reply to Inaros's request for help by sending one of their generals and a fleet of ships. It comes to a battle between the forces of Inaros and the Athenians on one side, and the Persian occupying force under Achaemenes. And the site of the battle is Sakha, most likely, which is in northern Egypt. So Sakha is basically here today. It's a tiny little village. There's almost nothing there. But strategically, it's a fairly significant point, because Sakha was essentially a crossroads. The road that led overland to Memphis ran through Sakha, and so did one of the most direct river routes that would take a fleet to Memphis as well. So what seems to happen here in the Battle of Sakha, or Papramis, as it's also called, is that the Athenians are trying to fight their way upriver with aid from Inaros's armies of rebels, essentially fighting overland. The Persians are defeated quite comprehensively. In fact, they're defeated so much that the Persian satrap Achaemenes is actually killed. Inaros then sends his body back to Persia as a warning, basically telling them, don't send another satrap because we're going to kill him too. The Athenians and the Egyptians under Inaros then continue their march towards Memphis. Unfortunately, a great number of Persian soldiers escape the Battle of Sakha and manage to retreat to Memphis to join the Persian garrison that's already there. We know from earlier times, especially the Third Intermediate period, there are a great number of descriptions of the defenses of Memphis under a ruler called Pi, who tried to attack it repeatedly. And one of the things that we know is that the walls of Memphis at this time are built basically right down to the edge of the river. It makes it very, very difficult to land any kind of besieging force. And of course, parking your ships right under the walls of Memphis sort of invites people to drop all kinds of stuff on your head. So Memphis is a pretty unassailable fortress at this point. And in fact, the Inaros and his Athenian allies do not try or simply do not have the ability to storm Memphis, and especially not the great citadel in the center of Memphis. They basically try to dislodge the Persians there with a siege. It doesn't seem to go very well. The city is too well defended. The Persians try all kinds of methods to cause trouble for the Athenians. They allegedly bribe Sparta to invade Athenian territory to try to distract them. They also assemble a relief force under Megabyces, a Persian general, which is sent to Egypt. So the forces besieging Memphis know that there is help on the way for the Persians inside. And gradually, this very protracted siege I guess, causes the armies to begin fracturing, essentially, so that when Megabyces arrives, he's able to lift the siege of Memphis fairly easily, because the forces of Inaros, the rebel forces, which may have comprised to a great extent farmers and others that had sort of rallied to his cause, they were unlikely to stick with him for the long run. So his armies must have begun to sort of fall apart due to simply the lack of any progress for years and years. Now, the Athenians retreat allegedly to the island of Prosopitis in the Nile, and they essentially prepare for a Persian siege. Now, there are some different accounts here. Either the Athenian force is entirely slaughtered, or they are allowed free passage out of Egypt, essentially along the Marmarican coast, all the way out to Cyrenaica, and then from there return home to Athens. But whatever the fallout of this, whatever the end of the Athenian expedition to Egypt, it basically has the same effect on Inaros. Without his Athenian allies, his rebellion begins to fall apart in earnest. Eventually, what remains of his army, which also included a number of Athenians that had basically stayed to fight with him and had not joined their comrades being besieged by the Persians. They're sort of hunted all over Egypt. They're eventually defeated in battle by Megabyces. Inaros and quite a lot of the Athenian commanders are captured, and they're brought back to Susa as captives. Now, they are allegedly promised that they will not be executed by the Persian king Artaxerxes. Now, whether that is correct, I'm not quite sure, but certainly after about a year in Susa, the queen mother of Persia, Amestris, who also happens to be the mother of the Persian satrap Achaemenes, whom Inaros had killed, basically she spends a year besieging the Persian king to basically let her have vengeance on the people who killed her son. She asks to be handed 50 Greeks and Inaros himself, of course. Eventually, the Persian king relents, and Inaros and his allies are either crucified or impaled on stakes. It's not really clear which one it is. Now, this whole event is quite fascinating in a sense, because we know that the Egyptians from the late period at least, but even a little bit earlier, had growing contact with the Hellenistic world and a growing interest in the Hellenistic world. Not only were there more Greeks in Egypt itself, in places like now Crates and Thonis Heracleon, we see Greek temples, Greek material culture. The Egyptians are gradually becoming somewhat more Hellenized, also through the Egyptian use of Greek mercenaries, which is quite extensive during the late period. So really, when we talk about Hellenistic Egypt, we tend to talk about the Ptolemaic period, when Egypt actually comes under the rule of a dynasty that is Hellenistic, or Macedonian at least. But really, Egypt had already, by this point in history, a very, very good relationship with much of the Hellenistic world, and a very developed relationship. It wasn't always peaceful, it wasn't always friendly, but it was certainly quite well developed. And I guess the rebellion of Inaros, as a link, I suppose, as an event that is part of this sort of wider tapestry of Peloponnesian wars, it mainly matters because it's an example of Athens essentially trying to punch itself, punch on above its weight on the world stage. Not one that ends particularly well for the Athenians, of course, but nevertheless an attempt to engage in very much international power politics. So with that, I'm going to stop talking, and I will be very happy to answer any questions you may have.